Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back in time, past the candles, past the clattering armor, right into the dusty stone corridors of a medieval castle. Picture this. You're standing in a drafty great hall, the scent of roasted meat and wet wool in the air, trying to make conversation while wearing 20 pounds of itchy wool and a face full of nerves. Flirting is a formal ritual. And romance? Well, it's more like a well-rehearsed performance. You don't just wink across the room. Heavens, no. You present your sleeve, bow a little too low, and quote poetry that's been passed around for centuries. You're a knight, a lady, or someone pretending to be either. And somehow, you're supposed to find love through an intricate dance of manners and metaphor. And you probably won't survive this. Not socially, at least. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere, someone's falling asleep to medieval heartbreak at 3 a.m. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing beneath a high, arched ceiling, the air as cold as a crypt, dressed in your stiffest linen, and praying the Lord's daughter doesn't notice your hands are shaking. The great hall hums with low voices, the scrape of wooden spoons against trenchers, and the occasional bark of a dog begging near the hearth. You steal a glance at her, just one, and nearly trip over a stool. So smooth. In the world of nobles, love, if you can call it that, has rules. It's called courtly love, and it's as far from spontaneous affection as boiled cabbage is from a chocolate truffle. You don't pursue her directly. That would be scandalous. Instead, you serve her, like a vassal might serve a lord. You compose poems full of overwrought longing and metaphors involving falcons, flowers, and seasonal weather patterns. You fight in tournaments wearing her favor, a bit of ribbon tied to your lance, and maybe, just maybe, she nods at you from a balcony. Mainstream history paints this era of noble romance in rosy hues. Gallant knights, blushing maidens, whispered oaths under moonlight. But reality? More like aching backs from kneeling too long and hoping your lute doesn't break mid-ballad. You can't just say, "I like you." That would be far too human. Instead, you memorize the right verses, the wrong compliment, or too much eye contact, and suddenly you're offending her honor, which, unfortunately for you, is legally protected by pointy things. You write her a letter, not a quick note, but an epic of longing, and deliver it via a servant who has to pretend not to notice how your hands tremble. And she, in return, may respond with absolutely nothing, or worse, a veiled rejection written in a polite rhyme that subtly implies you should take holy orders and stop bothering her. Historians still argue whether this whole courtly love thing was taken seriously by most people, or whether it was just a literary trend, like medieval fan fiction. After all, much of what survives are poems, ballads, and the romanticized writings of troubadours who, frankly, never kissed a single noblewoman in their lives. And the chivalric code? That's less about romance and more about controlling violent men in a world full of grudges and sharp steel. Knights were expected to be both terrifying in battle and tender in affection, like if John Wick recited Shakespeare in between fight scenes. There's a fringe theory some scholars entertain that the whole noble, courtly love genre served as a pressure valve. Noble women, trapped in dynastic marriages, got to experience idealized affection without the real-life consequences, while their admirers got to be endlessly rejected in the most poetic possible way. Everyone wins, sort of. In practice, love among the nobility was usually arranged. Your parents picked someone based on land, titles, and whether their family hadn't recently been excommunicated. But that didn't mean you couldn't flirt around the edges. A sly compliment at a feast, a shared glance during a hunt. These were your tiny rebellions. Sometimes, of course, things got messier. There were secret affairs, letters smuggled in saddlebags, and love tokens hidden in prayer books. And when those secret dalliances were discovered, let's just say that medieval castles had dungeons for more than just bandits. One nobleman, legend says, tried to woo a married lady by staging a mock dragon attack outside her manor, arriving in costume to rescue her. Unfortunately, he tripped over his papier-mâché tail and sprained his ankle. The lady laughed for a full week and went right back to ignoring him. Still, you keep trying. You learn to dance badly. You read Ovid's Art of Love and scribble its lines into the margins of prayer books. You write songs that rhyme desire with fire and somehow convince yourself it's original. At night, you stare up at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the tower walls, wondering whether love is really worth freezing your toes off in the corridor just to catch a glimpse of someone walking by with a candle. And deep down, you already know the answer. You wake with straw in your hair. The rooster's been crowing since before sunrise, and your only plan for the day is not to collapse in the fields. You're a peasant. Your hands are calloused, and your shirt smells like wet hay and boiled barley. But there's one thing keeping you going. She's drawing water at the well again. Forget noble courtyards and velvet tunics. Out here, love begins with hauling buckets and ends with your sheep eating her family's cabbage patch. Romance in the countryside isn't wrapped in poetry. It's wrapped in mud, practicality, and a very strong hope that her father doesn't own a pitchfork. You catch her eye as you pass. She's got straw on her sleeves and a smudge of soot across one cheek. She's radiant, not in the romantic candlelit sense. She's literally reflecting sunlight off her sweat. But that's beside the point. Peasant courtship is straightforward in its own complicated way. You flirt by helping her chop wood or slipping her the nicer half of your turnip. If you can manage to find a piece of ribbon, maybe one you borrowed from the miller's daughter's laundry line, you give it to her as a token. Of course, it's also entirely possible she gives it back with a look that says, "Absolutely not." Still, that doesn't stop you. The big difference out here is that you actually get to marry for something closer to affection. Not always. Parents still have a say, especially if your families have known each other since the Black Death. But at least you're not being traded for goats and land titles. Usually, you work together, your hands moving through the soil while trying to impress her with the number of rats you killed last week. You make her laugh twice and nearly fall into a ditch doing it. That's a win. Some villages have local customs, spring festivals where young men wear garlands, girls toss flowers, and you try to sneak off into the woods without a chaperone noticing. There's music, rough cider, and a lot of staring at each other awkwardly while pretending to understand what the fiddler is playing. Fringe traditions crop up depending on the region. In parts of medieval Wales, for example, there was something called a bundling bag, basically a way for a courting couple to spend the night together with a cloth barrier between them. A medieval cuddle pillow fort, if you will. Historians still argue whether people actually respected the rules or just got very good at untying knots in the dark. You carve her a comb from bone. Takes you 2 weeks and a minor injury. But she accepts it with a shy smile and a whispered thank you. That's the medieval equivalent of getting her number. But even with all this innocent charm, things can turn sour fast. Jealousy in a tight-knit community spreads like mold in a damp pantry. You walk her home, and suddenly 3 other lads want to know why. One of them is her cousin. The other has a knife. You see how this could escalate. Sometimes love takes the form of song. Not the elegant ballads of the troubadours, but the rough ditties passed from barn to barn, part melody, part joke, part gossip. You hear your name in one. It's not flattering, but at least it rhymes. Then there's the church, always watching. They want your courtship to lead swiftly to marriage, and your marriage to be respectable, chaste, at least before the vows, and well attended. You're meant to be betrothed before any serious kissing happens, and even then, you're not supposed to enjoy it too much. But people are people. One traveling friar recorded with a long-suffering sigh that more than half the village weddings he officiated were urgently scheduled after the bride started showing signs of pregnancy. Turns out, passion waits for no papal decree. And then there's the night you sneak away to meet her, past your snoring father, over the fence, through a field where the cow definitely sees you and is judging you. You whisper her name twice, and she appears at the window. You talk for a while about the harvest, about how her sister is marrying that red-headed guy who smells like onions. You brush her fingers with yours, and your whole chest feels like it's on fire. Suddenly, a dog barks, someone yells, and you're running through the dark like a thief. Your only crime? Liking someone too openly. But somehow, that makes it feel even more real. Love in the Fields isn't about elegance. It's about effort, about carving spoons and building fences and looking someone in the eye after a long day and still thinking, yes, them. One elderly peasant woman, whose memory we only know through a chronicler who definitely paraphrased her, reportedly said, "A man who knows how to thatch well and keeps his firewood dry is worth 3 with fancy boots and no oats." Sage advice. And when 2 young people finally get permission to marry, the village erupts. There's dancing, drinking, and the world's most chaotic singing. Someone probably falls in a ditch. The couple, meanwhile, gets one shared blanket, a tiny loft space above a goat pen, and the start of a life as hard as stone, but maybe just as lasting. You fall asleep that night, exhausted, bruised, and grinning like a fool. Because love out here, it's not subtle, but it's yours. You're standing beside your father, who's just spent the last hour negotiating your future like he's haggling over a slightly bruised pig. You haven't said a word. You're not expected to, because in the medieval world, love rarely comes before marriage, and marriage isn't about love at all. It's a transaction, a contract, a carefully measured deal that folds your heart into the same ledger as your family's grain stores and boundary stones. Your future spouse isn't chosen because they make you laugh, or because they once handed you a flower in the rain. They're chosen because their family owns 37 sheep, 2 oxen, and half the mill rights along the stream. Romance is just collateral damage. The 2 fathers shake hands. You've just been betrothed. This wasn't just a noble custom, though it was especially common among the upper class, where land, lineage, and alliances were sacred. Even among commoners, practical marriages were the rule. You married the girl from the next village over, not because you had chemistry, but because her father needed help with his barley fields, and your family wanted to avoid blood feuds over that path through the woods. And once it's arranged, that's it. No backing out, unless you want to be hauled before a church court or start a local war. You're promised, and promises in this world are sticky things, backed by dowries, livestock, and sometimes a nervous priest trying to keep things from escalating. The dowry system, oh, it's a joy. Your family is expected to cough up a tidy sum, money, goods, or land, to sweeten the deal. The more they offer, the more desirable you seem, which is just another way of saying your worth is measured in how much furniture and salt pork you come with. There's also the reverse, a bride price, where the groom pays the bride's family. Either way, you're being itemized, like a cart, or a very expensive chicken. Now, if you're part of the nobility, the stakes are even higher. Marriages are used to secure borders, end wars, or pull off sneaky political maneuvers. You might be married off to someone who doesn't speak your language or even live in the same country. Sometimes you're betrothed at age 7, just to keep the alliance locked in before puberty complicates things. There's a famous case of Isabella of Valois, who was married to King Richard II of England when she was 6 years old. 6. That's not a love story. It's a royal hostage situation. Historians still argue whether these child marriages were expected to be consummated right away, or just function as placeholders until the kids were older. Either way, super normal, super chill. And what if you fall in love with someone else? You don't. Or you pretend not to. Or you write cryptic poetry and hope your spouse doesn't know how to read. Some couples make it work. They learn to like each other, or at least to tolerate the smell of each other's feet. They raise children, share chores, and build a rhythm. But some don't. They sleep in separate spaces. They argue about pigs. They nurse private regrets until they turn into legends whispered by their grandchildren. You might try to plead your case to the priest. He'll listen, then remind you that marriage is a sacrament, not a suggestion. Unless your spouse turns out to be secretly married already or disturbingly related to you, you're locked in. And even then, it could take a papal bull the size of a blanket to untangle it. Quirkier traditions pop up in village courts. In some places, a woman could demand a divorce, technically a separation, if her husband failed to provide bread for 3 days. But you'd have to stand in front of the entire village and say so publicly, which is basically the medieval version of posting your personal drama on a church bulletin board. Still, not every marriage is a misery. Some are lucky. 2 people who, despite the odds, grow fond of each other. They learn each other's habits, forgive each other's snoring, and maybe even sneak a smile during chores. But when it starts, you're not thinking about any of that. You're sitting on a wooden stool while your family discusses how many chickens they'll need to hand over to secure your romantic fate. Your bride or groom is doing the same thing. 3 farms over, probably wondering if you've got all your teeth. In the ceremony, there's a moment where your hands are bound together with a ribbon or piece of cloth, symbolizing unity. You don't speak much. You nod at the right places. You say, "I will," when the priest cues you. There's no, "Do you take this person to be your lawfully wedded?" No room for backing out. Just binding, blessing, and trying not to faint from nerves or overheating in your best wool tunic. The feast afterward is more relaxed. There's ale, dried apples, meat pies, and a very loud uncle who insists on giving an emotional speech with his mouth full. That night, everyone expects you to. Well, begin the marital phase. But mostly, you just stare at each other and hope you're not snoring when the chickens wake up. And so, you're married. Not because you chose each other, but because your parents, your priest, and possibly your village pig all agreed it was a good idea. Love? That's extra and optional. You're sitting in the back pew trying to pretend you're just here for confession. But let's be honest. You're mostly here to figure out if you're going to medieval hell for kissing someone behind the bakery. Because in this world, the church sees everything. And when it comes to love, dating, and anything even mildly fun, it has a long list of opinions. You can't just walk up to someone and flirt. Oh no. That flirty glance, that playful touch, that little moment of chemistry. Depending on the local bishop, that could be classed as near occasion of sin. You're not even allowed to think too much about someone unless you're planning to marry them. And soon. The church taught that marriage was sacred and that sexuality had one job: make babies in wedlock, preferably quietly. Anything else? That's you, flirting with eternal damnation, friend. So you sit there in the pew, trying to recall if that brief shoulder graze counted as impure thought number 23 or 24 this month. Confession wasn't just a once-a-year kind of thing. It could be weekly, especially if you were the type to wander past your crush's house a little too often. You'd kneel, murmur your sins to a tired priest, and brace for a lecture about guarding the senses or avoiding lascivious behavior, which, translated from Latin, basically means stop being so obvious. And yet, somehow, everyone kept doing it anyway. Priests were expected to oversee community morality, and that meant keeping an eye on courtship. Holding hands in public? Scandalous. Kissing in the churchyard? Downright heretical. And if someone caught you, well, enjoy your public penance, which could range from standing barefoot outside the church to being assigned to fast on bread and water for several days. Nothing kills the mood like enforced starvation. There's a recorded case from 14th century France where a young man was whipped publicly for sneaking kisses beneath the market canopy. Harsh? Yes. Effective? Debatable. Because apparently he was caught again a month later, this time behind a wagon of cabbages. Even weddings required a bishop's blessing if you wanted the full stamp of legitimacy. Otherwise, your marriage might not count, especially if there were any questions about consanguinity. That's right. The church kept track of who was related to whom, often across 7 degrees of separation. And in small towns, that's a lot of overlap. Historians still argue whether these strict rules actually prevented immoral behavior or just pushed it into darker corners. But the written records are clear. For every rule, there was someone breaking it behind the stable. Then there's Lent, 40 long days of spiritual discipline during which you're expected to abstain from everything remotely indulgent, including romantic behavior. No touching, no wooing, no suggestive glances across the barley sacks. Just prayer, reflection, and guilt. Of course, rules varied wildly. A lenient parish priest might look the other way if the couple was close to marriage. Others enforced the rules so tightly that even betrothed couples could barely exchange a smile without someone from the altar yelling, "Temptation." And let's talk about the sin scales. Not all impure acts were equal in the eyes of the church. There were detailed manuals, like the penitentials, that spelled out exactly what kind of punishment was required for each type of misbehavior. Yes, someone actually sat down and made a spreadsheet of sins: kissing with lustful intent, moderate penance, secret trysts under moonlight, major penance, anything more scandalous. We're talking public humiliation, and in some cases, excommunication. But here's the quirky part. Local folk traditions often clashed with official doctrine. Some regions had matchmaking festivals, fertility rituals, or playful courting games that danced dangerously close to forbidden behavior. In parts of Germany, there were springtime customs where boys would steal girls' ladders so they'd have to come out and talk. The church tried to stamp out these practices, but they were like dandelions. Cut one down, and 3 more would sprout up by the next festival. And if you did manage to get married properly, the church was still watching. You were supposed to sleep together, but only on sanctioned days. Sundays, feast days, fasting days, and the entire 40 days of Lent were off limits, which meant the average medieval couple might have had a calendar less about love and more about nope. Not tonight, either. One priest wrote despairingly in his diary that he'd caught a couple attempting improper relations during Advent. His tone suggested they'd basically tried to light the nativity scene on fire. But let's say you're careful. You keep your distance, confess your sins, and avoid temptation like it's a plague rat. That still doesn't guarantee safety, because even your intentions could get you in trouble. Dreaming about someone too fondly? Better confess that too. Scribes recorded dreams. No, really. Monks were taught to note their dreams in spiritual journals and reflect on whether they were sinful. Imagine waking up from a perfectly normal dream about holding hands and having to write a full page of remorse by candlelight. And so, every flirtation comes wrapped in a thick fog of anxiety. You like someone? Better hide it. You want to talk to them? Better bring a chaperone. You think about them late at night? Better grab your rosary and try not to look too guilty at morning mass. The church means well. Sort of. It's trying to build a stable society, one that doesn't collapse into chaos and unwed parenthood every harvest festival. But in doing so, it's made romance a tightrope walk over a pit of moral scorpions. You lie in bed that night, the straw mat crackling beneath you, and wonder, if you held their hand for just a second longer, would that be a venial sin or a mortal one? You fall asleep before you decide. You've decided you're in love. You've whispered sweet nothings through a hedgerow, sent awkward glances across the grain field, and shared a stale oat cake behind the stables. But now, disaster. Your uncle's caught wind of it, and he's not just furious. He's gathering reinforcements, because in the medieval world, not all romance ends in a sanctioned church wedding with doves and dry bread. Sometimes it ends in a frantic, muddy elopement through the woods while being chased by half your extended family, wielding torches and angry moral principles. You and your beloved are from rival families, or maybe just families with conflicting ambitions. Perhaps one side wants a better match. Maybe there's a prior promise hanging awkwardly in the air. Or maybe someone in your bloodline insulted someone else's great-grandfather during a sheep counting contest. Either way, your love is now officially forbidden. What do? You run. Elopements weren't just the stuff of storybooks. They happened. People slipped out at night, met at crossroads or secret shrines, and tried to find a priest willing to bless a hasty union before angry relatives could intervene. Often, a couple would flee to a place just outside the local jurisdiction, a neighboring village, a distant chapel, or a conveniently located hermit who'd seen a lot of drama and really just wanted to finish his soup. The church didn't love this. They preferred weddings to be public, announced, and witnessed. But canon law did recognize marriage by mutual consent. If you both swore you meant it, if it was said aloud, and if nobody was already married to someone else. And that led to complications. Historians still argue whether these clandestine marriages were widespread enough to threaten church authority, or just a convenient loophole for lovebirds and the very impatient. Either way, they caused enough panic that later medieval reforms tried to crack down, requiring bans, public announcements, witnesses, and lots more ecclesiastical paperwork. But rules or no rules, young lovers found ways. There's a 14th century tale of a blacksmith's daughter who eloped with a miller's apprentice. They met beneath a moonlit tree, swapped simple vows, and fled to a monastery where the abbot reluctantly blessed the union, only for the girl's father to show up the next day with 3 cousins and a sheep cart full of bribe money. The priest insisted the marriage stood, unless annulled by Rome. Rome, of course, took forever. By then, the couple had 3 kids and a thriving oat business. Even among nobles, elopement scandals stirred the pot. There's a legendary account of a young lady who disguised herself as a servant to escape with a lesser knight. They got halfway to the coast before being caught by the girl's brother, who forgave them only because the knight promised to duel a Danish raider by morning, which somehow worked out. Of course, things didn't always end well. Some runaway couples were caught and forcibly separated. In certain places, this could lead to public shaming. The man might be put in the stocks, the woman made to walk barefoot through the village while reciting prayers about obedience. Nothing says romantic tragedy like splinters and public lectures. Others weren't so lucky. If the families were powerful or particularly vengeful, things could get violent. Stories abound of young lovers being locked in towers, sent to monasteries, or declared legally dead for inheritance reasons. One poor lad, according to court records from York, was dumped in a pond by his would-be father-in-law. He survived, but allegedly developed a lifelong fear of ducks. Still, despite the risks, people eloped. Love, or at least infatuation with a very specific person, and a strong dislike for arranged marriages, drove people to desperate plans. And let's be honest, some of those plans involved a lot of terrible timing. You might hide in a wagon beneath bales of hay. You might ride double on a tired donkey through the night. You might climb out a window, only to realize you've left your shoes behind and must now elope barefoot through thorn brush. Quirky regional customs sometimes aided the love-struck. In some parts of medieval Brittany, couples who spent the night bundled, yes, again with the bundling, could later claim a kind of common law marriage. And in the Scottish borders, so many runaway weddings happened at Gretna Green that it became legendary for hosting impulsive vows. Of course, you'd need to convince a priest, or at least someone who looked like one. A minor problem. Fake priests were occasionally discovered performing ceremonies for a fee. These so-called marriage tricksters would vanish the moment things got complicated. One famous incident involved a traveling weaver posing as a friar who married 23 couples before disappearing with the community's goose. Still, you and your beloved press on. You make it to a chapel just before dawn. A sleepy clergyman blesses your union. You exchange vows in your muddy clothes, and for a brief, perfect moment, the world fades. It's just the two of you, hands entwined, breathless and terrified, but together. Then you hear the distant bark of a familiar hunting dog. The chase isn't quite over, but maybe, if you're lucky, forgiveness will follow. Families sometimes came around, especially when grandchildren were involved, or local gossip made it too messy to stay angry. And when reconciliation happened, it usually involved a feast. Bread, meat, ale, and awkward silence broken by someone's aunt insisting she knew it was true love all along. You fall asleep that night, curled beside your partner, heart pounding, bruises on your shins, and hay in your shirt. You don't know what tomorrow brings. But tonight, you ran for love, and you made it. You're desperate now, not for love, necessarily, but for help. Because the object of your affection hasn't looked your way in days, Your romantic efforts are flailing like a goose in a windstorm, and you've run out of turnips to offer as tokens of affection. So naturally, you turn to the local expert. She's older, sharp-eyed, always smells faintly of garlic and dried lavender, and people whisper that she talks to her cat a bit too much. But she also has something else, a reputation, not just as an herbalist, not just as a healer, but as someone who knows about potions, love potions. You approach her cottage with all the subtlety of a moon-struck donkey. She's waiting by the fire, already pouring something that hisses faintly and smells like rose petals, vinegar, and bad decisions. She squints at you, listens to your tale of woe, and nods like she's heard it all before, probably because she has. You hand over a few coins, a handful of dried apples, and that one shiny brooch you found near the stream last summer. In exchange, she gives you a vial of murky liquid and a long list of instructions. Most of them involve timing, incantations, and not using too much, or you might end up in love with a goat. Medieval love magic was everywhere, part medicine, part folklore, part chaotic improvisation. People turned to it when ordinary wooing failed, and while the church officially condemned it, enforcement was inconsistent. Besides, you're not doing magic. You're just asking nature for a favor. The recipes vary. One love potion, recorded in a 15th century manuscript, included wine, ground ivy, powdered antler, and just a pinch of menstrual blood. Another featured mashed strawberries, honey, and something the monk didn't translate because it was apparently too scandalous. Historians still argue whether these concoctions were ever believed to work, or if the ritual itself, the act of trying, was more about giving the hopeless, romantic, a sense of agency. A placebo with strong side effects, basically. And it wasn't just potions. Charms were worn, talismans carved, prayers whispered over steaming cauldrons. Some swore by astrology, consulting star charts to determine the best day to propose. One chronicler even mentions a man who delayed his wedding 3 times to wait for Venus in the ascendant, only to lose his bride to a fisherman who didn't believe in planets. Matchmakers also roamed the social landscape, not the modern kind with spreadsheets and questionnaires, but sharp-tongued widows and elderly gossips who knew things. They could recite entire family trees from memory, name every eligible girl in 3 villages, and tell you, without blinking, who had soft hands, a good dowry, and a temper like a wet hen. You visit one of these women, hoping for insight. She asks a few questions, smacks you with a wooden spoon when you answer poorly, then declares you'll need to marry a girl from the next hamlet over, because the stars said so. And also her father has cows. Romance meet logistics. These matchmakers operated within communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, which means if you messed things up by backing out, getting caught in a lie, or insulting someone's soup, you might be banned from future recommendations. A medieval romantic blacklist. No one wants that. And then there were love tests. Superstitions meant to reveal the true feelings of a potential partner. You might place a sprig of yarrow under your pillow and whisper a charm to dream of your future spouse, or drop molten lead into water to watch it form a shape. A shoe for travel, a ring for marriage, a blob for you should probably stay single. One fringe tidbit from Bohemia claimed you could tie 9 knots in a string, hide it in your crush's coat, and if they smiled within the hour, they loved you. If they sneezed, they might love you someday. If they choked, run. It's all a bit ridiculous, but also deeply human. When feelings run wild and nothing else seems to work, you turn to the fantastical. Because what else do you have? Certainly not privacy, or good soap, or access to romantic comedies. Just muddy roads, uncertain glances, and a hope that dried basil really can make someone love you back. But let's not pretend this was all harmless fun. Sometimes these magical efforts backfired, socially or spiritually. The church saw love magic as dangerously close to demonic meddling. Getting caught using a potion could land you in hot water, or worse, accused of witchcraft. There's a story from 15th century Florence of a woman who made charms for young lovers. Business was booming until a jealous rival accused her of bewitching a wealthy merchant's daughter. She fled, but not before allegedly planting a hairbrush that made the daughter fall in love with a chimney sweep. Whether it's true or not, it made the rounds as a cautionary tale. Don't mess with magic, or you'll end up marrying someone covered in soot. Still, you can't resist. You brew your own potion in secret. It smells like regret and rosemary, and you slip a drop into your beloved's cider. She takes a sip, makes a face, and says she prefers ale. That's it. No spark, no swoon. But somehow, over the next few days, she starts smiling when you're around. Coincidence? You don't know. But you also don't tell anyone what you did, because love in the medieval world might be constrained by rules, arranged by parents, policed by the church. But sometimes you still reach for the wild, the strange, the ancient rituals whispered by firelight. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, a little powdered antler really can change your luck. You're pacing by the edge of a muddy road, clutching a folded bit of parchment that smells faintly like beeswax and desperation. Your sweetheart lives 3 counties away, and the only postal service is your second cousin, who sometimes forgets to deliver messages because he gets distracted by cider and singing contests. This is medieval long-distance dating, and it's slow. Let's say you're a young knight, recently posted to some remote border castle where the only company is a goat named Beatrice and a very judgmental squire. Your beloved is back home, embroidering in the solar and wondering if you're dead, married, or just really bad at letter writing. You want to stay connected. You try to write. But even if your quill doesn't snap, and you manage to find a bit of parchment that isn't already covered in butter stains, the journey itself is a gamble. Mail might be carried by a servant, a traveling merchant, a friar heading in the right direction, or, let's be honest, whoever looks the least likely to steal it for kindling. There's no central delivery system. If your letter actually arrives, it's a minor miracle. When it does, it's a whole event. A wax seal is broken. A private corner is found. The words are read and reread, sometimes aloud, sometimes in secret. If you're lucky, they rhyme. If you're really lucky, they don't rhyme too badly. People in long-distance courtships poured their feelings into ink. Entire pages might be devoted to describing a single sigh or the way the moon looked on the night they last parted. Mainstream history gives us countless examples of these letters, some beautiful, some painfully overdone. One nobleman once spent 3 paragraphs describing the way his beloved's hand looked while feeding geese. That's commitment. But not everyone could write. Literacy varied. Among peasants, most correspondence relied on intermediaries, friends who could read, traveling clergy, or even memorized messages repeated like folk songs. One fringe tale from a fishing village tells of a woman who sent her lover a verbal poem via a barefoot monk. The monk allegedly added his own commentary between verses. Historians still argue whether the resulting breakup was due to artistic liberties or just bad rhyming. Of course, visiting in person was the gold standard. But that was easier said than done. Travel in the medieval world was slow, dangerous, and full of logistical nightmares. You needed a reason to be on the road. "I'm off to visit my sweetheart" wasn't always sufficient. You risked bandits, wolves, bad weather, and roads that were more pothole than path. If you made it, though, oh, that reunion. You'd arrive exhausted, mud-caked, possibly bleeding from a run-in with a very territorial goose. But nothing would matter when you saw each other again. There might be tears, there might be laughter. There might be an awkward moment involving a jealous younger sibling and a bucket of fish guts. For those separated by war, letters became lifelines. Crusaders, knights, and soldiers of fortune often left behind loves who waited for years. Some never returned. Others came back changed, older, quieter. And still, their letters, if preserved, offer us some of the most tender glimpses into medieval hearts. Love across distance wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a test of loyalty, of memory, of patience. One letter from a 12th century French woman to her absent husband reads, "I kiss the place where your feet have walked," which is beautiful. Until you realize he probably hadn't bathed in a month. Quirky traditions emerged in long-distance courting. Some lovers exchanged tokens. Rings, ribbons, carved wood, even locks of hair braided with thread. One merchant's daughter allegedly mailed her suitor a small wheel of cheese shaped like a heart. He replied by sending back a poem that included the line, "Thy dairy gift, like thy love, did ripen sweet." We can only assume he meant it as a compliment. And yet, even with all the obstacles, the system kind of worked. People adapted. They found ways. Some grew closer through words alone, learning each other in the space between lines. Others drifted apart, undone by distance, silence, or one too many misdirected messages. Sometimes the gaps stretched longer than expected. Illness, weather, politics, all could delay a letter for weeks or months. Imagine waiting through winter, staring at the same road every morning, wondering if they'd forgotten you or simply couldn't get past the washed-out bridge near Lark's Hollow. And when messages were misinterpreted, well, that's where it gets tricky. One poor shepherd wrote a very flowery love letter with metaphors involving sheep, stars, and wool. It was accidentally delivered to the town reeve's wife, who promptly showed it to her husband, who threatened to have the shepherd flogged. The shepherd tried to explain, but frankly, the phrase, "your voice rings like the bleating of angels," doesn't clear things up. Still, you keep writing. You send letters on scraps of cloth, carved wood, wax tablets, whatever you can find. You trust the messenger, or at least bribe them with half a loaf of bread and a warning not to sniff the envelope. And you hope, not just for a reply, but for the memory of someone who still thinks of you, far away, in a world with no phones, no emails, and no guarantee that anything will get where it's supposed to go. But when a reply does arrive, sealed and scrawled and smelling faintly of familiar smoke and rosemary, everything stops. You unfold it slowly, careful not to tear the edge. You read the lines 3 times, and suddenly the distance feels a little smaller. Love travels slowly in this world, but it does travel. You're standing beneath a window at dusk, trying not to cough from the smoke drifting out of the chimney directly above you. You've rehearsed your lines. Your lute is mostly in tune, and you've bribed your cousin to make sure her father doesn't come outside mid-performance with a chamber pot. Tonight, you're going to sing. Badly, but with heart. Because in medieval times, romance had a soundtrack. And often, it was very public. Love wasn't just whispered behind barns or written in secret letters. It was shouted from balconies, played on fiddles in crowded taverns, and turned into verses recited during feast day festivals, while everyone awkwardly avoided eye contact with the couple in question. Your feelings were a performance, and everyone got front row seats. Music and poetry were 2 of the most common ways to express affection, especially if you weren't noble enough to write long letters or wealthy enough to buy expensive gifts. All you needed was a voice, a bit of rhyme, and a stomach strong enough to handle public embarrassment. The tradition of serenading had roots in the courts of troubadours, those poetic singer-songwriters of southern France who roamed from castle to castle, composing songs about unattainable love, star-crossed passion, and women with impossibly tiny waists. One troubadour compared his lady to a falcon made of gold who lived on a cloud. Another rhymed heart with part, start, art, and, unfortunately, fart. Creativity had its limits. Historians still argue whether these performances were meant to woo real people or just gain patronage from bored nobles. But either way, the idea spread. Soon, even common folk were attempting poetry. Crude, hilarious, occasionally weird poetry, but heartfelt all the same. So here you are, strumming a simple melody. Your song's not great. You rhymed kiss with bliss and then with fish, which made sense in your head because she sells herring on market days. You try to sing softly, but your nerves betray you, and your voice cracks halfway through the chorus. A dog howls. A window creaks. And then she laughs, not mockingly, not cruelly, just the sound of someone recognizing the effort. She leans out, gives you a look equal parts fond and amused, and tosses down a small embroidered cloth. That's a yes, or at least a nice try. Public declarations of love were a social gamble. If they went well, you were a romantic hero. If they flopped, you were the story at the tavern for the next 3 years. In one village account, a young man composed a 14-verse love song and performed it on the church steps, only to discover the girl he was serenading had already married his older brother that morning. He finished the song anyway. Bold. Love poetry wasn't just for show. It functioned like a social currency. A man who could recite verses, either his own or stolen from some book he definitely didn't read himself, gained prestige. It meant he had feelings, and maybe also decent handwriting. Women, too, composed love poems, often tucked inside sewing kits or scrawled along the edges of prayer books. Some were serious, others not so much. One fringe example from an Italian convent features a nun who wrote a passionate poem about the local fishmonger's son. Then immediately followed it with a confession that included the phrase, "And I sincerely regret the limerick." Medieval fairs and festivals gave lovers a stage. During May Day or midsummer celebrations, couples performed dances, exchanged gifts, and occasionally recited verses in front of the crowd. These events were half courtship, half theatrical competition. The stakes? Love, or at least mild flirtation, and a fresh pastry. Some regions even had love courts, semi-formal gatherings where people brought their romantic dilemmas to be judged by a panel, often noble women, who would decide whether someone's love poem was sufficiently heartfelt or if it lacked sincerity. Imagine having your emotional life critiqued like it's The Voice, feudal edition. But perhaps the most daring display of affection came in the form of a dawn song, or alba. A young man would wait until early morning to sing beneath his beloved's window, lamenting the coming of day that would separate them. It was dramatic. It was poetic. It was often interrupted by the town watch or a very annoyed rooster. Still, these performances mattered. They allowed emotion in a world where most things were dictated by duty and religion. They gave people, regardless of class, a chance to say, "I see you," in a world that rarely paused to let anyone be seen. Sometimes, you even hired someone else to perform for you, a friend with a better voice, or a traveling minstrel who could be bribed with a tankard of ale. One girl allegedly received a serenade that was so moving she agreed to marry the singer, only to discover he was merely lip-syncing while his friend hid behind a tree. She married the friend. Eventually. Of course, not everyone appreciated the effort. In some villages, late-night serenading was banned after too many romantic ballads disrupted livestock. A record from Lincolnshire describes a farmer who sued his neighbor for disturbing his hens with songs of love and questionable pitch. Justice was swift. The troubadour was told to confine his performances to reasonable hours and proper harmonies. And yet, despite the noise complaints and the awkward rhymes, the serenades continued. Because when all else failed, when letters were lost, parents disapproved, and love potions fizzled out in the cauldron, music remained. You strum the final note. The window closes, gently this time. You pick up the cloth she dropped, embroidered with a clumsy daisy, and press it to your chest like a knight holding a banner. It's not perfect. It's not polished. But it's yours. And for a moment, under the stars, in a world where romance often bows to duty, you sang your heart out. And someone listened. You wake up to find a chicken on your bed and a rumor in your name. Apparently, someone saw you walking with her near the mill pond, holding hands. By breakfast, it's turned into a full-fledged scandal, complete with imaginary kisses, stolen glances, and at least one baby you definitely didn't father. Welcome to the other side of medieval love, the messy, chaotic world of jealousy, affairs, and court gossip. Because for every romantic serenade or blushing proposal, there were tangled webs of rumor and betrayal lurking just beneath the surface, in a time when privacy was a luxury reserved for saints and ghosts. Everyone knew everyone's business. And when it came to love, they often knew it wrong. You're not even sure how it started. Maybe someone saw the two of you talking a little too long at the harvest festival. Maybe her cousin got jealous. Maybe the Reeves' wife just needed something new to talk about while churning butter. Whatever the case, it's spreading faster than the plague during pilgrimage season. In the tight quarters of village life, relationships didn't unravel quietly. They exploded. If you were caught in a love triangle, you weren't just navigating awkward emotions. You were navigating survival. Jealous rivals might challenge you to a fight. Or worse, they might write a very bad song about you and sing it at the tavern until you consider changing your name and moving to Flanders. Among the nobility, the stakes were even higher. Affairs weren't just scandalous, they were dangerous. Castles were breeding grounds for intrigue, betrayal, and whispers behind tapestries. A single misplaced flirtation could lead to exile, imprisonment, or a convenient hunting accident. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, brilliant, beautiful, and famously entangled in one of the most gossiped about royal marriages of the 12th century. Her husband, Henry II of England, was known for his temper and his infidelities. Eleanor? Rumors swirled around her, too. Did she have lovers? Did she plot against him? Historians still argue whether she was a wronged queen or a master manipulator, or both. And then there's the tale of Peter Abelard and Heloise. He was a philosopher. She was his student. Their passionate affair ended in scandal, secrecy, and castration. Yes, really. Their love letters survive, full of longing, sorrow, and philosophical musings on sin and duty. It's beautiful, and also a reminder that medieval relationships could get extremely out of hand. But even outside the royal court, jealousy brewed everywhere. Maybe you danced with someone else at the spring fair. Maybe your ex saw you talking to the baker's daughter. Maybe someone just doesn't like your face. Suddenly, you're the villain in a story you didn't write. Fringe traditions helped manage the drama. In some communities, if two people were in conflict over a romantic claim, they'd be brought before a local court. Not a legal one, but a lovers' tribunal, often presided over by the village elders. Both sides would present their case, sometimes including poems, witnesses, or embarrassing anecdotes. Judgment was rendered, sometimes fairly, sometimes hilariously. And if things escalated, duels weren't uncommon, especially among the upper class. A glance too long at the wrong lady, and suddenly swords were drawn, not always to the death, but always to the dramatic. There's a documented case in Italy of two knights who fought a duel on horseback over a misunderstanding involving a shared handkerchief. The winner proposed to the lady. She declined. Everyone went home, embarrassed. Among peasants, retribution took more creative forms. Jilted lovers might sabotage a rival's harvest, spread rumors about a goat infestation, or place a fish in someone's chimney. Revenge by smell. Highly effective. The church tried to keep order. Priests preached against envy, lust, and vengeful behavior. But they also had their own scandals. Monks and nuns occasionally broke vows, eloped, or ended up in awkward moral treatises written by their own abbots. One chronicle from a German monastery recounts a monk caught sneaking into the nunnery. His excuse? I was merely delivering psalms. With no pants? Public shame was a real risk. If you were caught in an affair, you could be made to confess before the congregation, barefoot, in a rough wool shift, holding a candle. People took notes. Some might even sketch. A few particularly cruel judges ordered the guilty parties to carry symbolic objects, like a broom for a swept-away heart, or a wooden spoon for stirring up trouble. And yet, somehow, people still risked it, because love doesn't follow rules, or calendars, or church lectures delivered by someone who's never kissed anyone, ever. You try to clear your name. You speak to the gossips. You show up at the well and make a joke about how you can't even hold hands properly, much less start a scandal. Some people laugh. Others narrow their eyes. You realize this might take a while. But something curious happens. The person at the heart of the rumor, the one you're accused of loving, doesn't deny it. In fact, they smile when you pass. Maybe not a big smile, maybe just a flicker, but enough. Maybe love is a battlefield. Maybe it's a cabbage patch, occasionally set on fire by jealousy. But it's also the feeling of seeing someone across a crowd of suspicious villagers and still thinking, there you are. So you let them gossip. You let them sing their bad songs. You just keep walking. Head up, heart full, and maybe, just maybe, with someone walking beside you. You're older now. Your hands are rougher. Your back aches before rain. And the wild, frantic thrum of youth has mellowed into something quieter, but no less profound. You glance across the table, and there they are, hunched over a bowl of onion pottage, muttering about how the cat's stolen another crust of bread. You smile, because you remember. You remember the awkward courtship, the chase, the chaos, the rules, the rumors. You remember the stolen glances, the singing. Dear God, the singing, the hopeful letters sent by cousin post, and the night you held hands beneath a tree and thought the world might actually stop turning for you, just for a moment. Love in the medieval world wasn't easy. It was a puzzle box full of social expectation, religious scrutiny, and the kind of physical discomfort that comes from wearing 12 layers of wool. But somehow, it still happened. When love survived all that, it became something ironclad. Marriage, whether arranged, chosen, or stumbled into after a very confusing bundling accident, became the foundation of family. And family, that was survival. It meant a roof in winter, hands to gather the harvest, people to say your name long after your bones rested beneath a yew tree. Legacies in this era weren't written in gold. They were spoken over hearths, passed down with recipes and tales. Your great-granddaughter might not know how you wooed your partner, but she'll know you were kind, or stubborn, or that you once insulted a lord's fashion sense and lived to laugh about it. And if you didn't marry, well, you weren't alone in that either. Some chose the church. Some chose work. Some lived in the same cottage all their lives and told wild stories about lost love to neighborhood children. Romance didn't always lead to marriage, and marriage didn't always mean love. But the traces of connection, those endured. You sit by the hearth now, the fire crackling low, the same way it has for decades. Someone brings up the tale of your youthful misadventures, the time you chased after love and ended up stuck in a barrel during a storm. You chuckle. They laugh. The story gets better every time. Historians still argue whether medieval people felt love the way we do now, whether our modern romantic ideals can really be mapped onto a world where marriage was mostly economic and affection was hidden behind ritual. But it doesn't matter what the scholars say, because you lived it. Maybe love wasn't always the centerpiece of life, but it colored the edges. It peered in at windows, stirred the pot, made people sing in alleys and weep in chapels. It made the world feel just a little less gray, even on the wettest of market days. And love changed things. Slowly, yes, but it did. Laws evolved. Customs softened. By the late Middle Ages, people began to talk more openly about affection. Courtship started to matter. Not everywhere, not for everyone. But the idea of choosing a partner, of following your heart, even just a little, began to take root. It still wasn't easy, but it wasn't nothing. You look at your partner now. They've fallen asleep in the chair beside you, mouth open slightly, holding a cup of ale they never finished. You poke the fire, settle back in your seat, and let the warmth of the room curl around you like a well-worn cloak. And somewhere in the distance, through fog, through time, through history itself, the echoes of a younger, you still hum a terrible love song under a star-lit window. So now, let's let the world slow down. The fire flickers low. The candles have burned down to puddles of wax. Outside, the village is quiet. No footsteps, no laughter, just the soft rustle of wind over thatched roofs. Somewhere far away, an owl calls once, then settles into silence. You shift under your blanket, feeling the calm settle in. That old medieval world, full of strange customs and surprising tenderness, drifts gently away behind you, like mist on a morning field. The castles, the muddy roads, the whispered promises, all dissolving into memory. Your breathing is softer now, slower, like a page being gently turned. And maybe you're still smiling a little, thinking about those bizarre traditions, the garlands, the jealous cousins, the far too earnest love songs. But it's a sleepy smile, one that settles into the corners of your dreams. Let your thoughts drift now, back to simpler things. A fire, a wooden chair, two people who chose each other day after day, through the storm, through the cold, through every quiet morning. Because even in the hardest times, even in the most tangled histories, there was always room for love. Not perfect love, not easy love, but real, lasting, human. Now close your eyes. Let the past grow still. You're warm. You're safe. You're home.